A white mobster called Bumpy Johnson the wrong word in front of his own men. Within 7 days, 8 bodies dropped across Harlem, not all at once, one by one. It happened in a speakeasy on 145th Street. Not a back alley, not a dark corner where words disappear into the night. A speakeasy, full of people, full of witnesses. Dutch Schultz walked in like he owned the place, and in his mind, maybe he did. He controlled the numbers racket in parts of Harlem. He had cops on payroll. He had judges in his pocket. He was white, he was connected, and in 1935, that made men like him feel bulletproof. Bumpy Johnson was already inside, sitting at a table near the back, not hiding, not performing, just present, the way a king is present without needing a throne. Schultz saw him, and Schultz made a choice. He walked over. Loud enough for the room to hear, drunk enough to believe his own legend, and he said the word, not in anger, worse than that, casually, like it was nothing, like Bumpy was nothing. The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock, the kind that comes from recognition, the kind that says, someone just made a mistake, they can't take back. Bumpy didn't move, he didn't stand, didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for a weapon. He looked at Schultz the way you look at a man who just signed his own death certificate and doesn't know it yet. Then he stood up, slowly, calmly. He walked past Schultz without saying a word, and he left. Schultz laughed. His men laughed with him. They thought they won. But the people in that room, the ones who actually lived in Harlem, the ones who knew Bumpy, they knew better. They knew what silence meant. They knew what patience looked like. And they knew that in 7 days the streets would remember this moment very differently, because Bumpy Johnson didn't need to respond with words. He never did. By the time the sun rose, every major player in Harlem knew what happened. Not because Bumpy told them, because the witnesses did. The bartender, the musicians, the numbers runners who were sitting 3 tables over, the story spread like fire, and with it a question, what is Bumpy going to do? Some thought he'd let it go. Schultz was connected. He had Italian mob backing. He had law enforcement on his side. Going after him would mean war. War with people who had more guns, more money, more protection. But those people didn't understand Bumpy. They didn't understand that for him, this was never about Schultz. It was about the word. It was about the fact that if a white mobster could walk into a Harlem speakeasy and disrespect him in front of his own people without consequence, then every hustler, every crooked cop, every opportunist would believe they could do the same, and Harlem would stop being his. So Bumpy didn't act out of rage. He acted out of principle. The next morning he made a phone call, then another, then another. He didn't gather an army. He didn't make speeches. He didn't declare war. He just activated the network he'd spent years building, a network of loyalty, of respect, of men who understood that in Harlem, Bumpy's word was law. Not because he demanded it, but because he earned it, and within 48 hours the first body dropped. Not Schultz. Not yet. One of his runners. A man who collected numbers on Lenox Avenue. A man who worked for Schultz but lived in Harlem. He disappeared on a Tuesday night. No gunshots. No struggle. Just gone. The police found him 3 days later in an empty lot near the river. No witnesses. No suspects. No arrests. Just a message. And the clock had started. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Bumpy Johnson was in 1935. Not the legend, not the myth that would grow over decades. The man. He was 30 years old, still young, but already untouchable in ways that had nothing to do with violence. Bumpy didn't rule Harlem through fear. He ruled it through respect. And respect, real respect, is harder to build than fear. It takes time. It takes consistency. It takes knowing when to act and when to hold back. Bumpy understood that. He grew up in South Carolina, moved to Harlem as a teenager, and learned the streets the hard way. He ran numbers. He did time. He watched men rise and fall based on how they treated the people around them. And he learned one rule that most gangsters never figure out. The community decides who stays in power. Not the police, not the politicians, not even the guns. The people. If the people trust you, you're untouchable. If they don't, you're already dead. You just don't know it yet. Bumpy built his power by being the man Harlem could rely on. When landlords tried to evict black families during the Depression, Bumpy paid their rent. When white mobsters tried to push into black neighborhoods and take over local businesses, Bumpy pushed back. When someone in the community needed protection, they didn't call the cops. They called Bumpy. He wasn't a Robin Hood. He wasn't a saint. He was a criminal. He made money off illegal gambling, extortion, and everything else that came with a life. But he had a code. He didn't prey on his own people. He didn't sell drugs in Harlem. He didn't allow his men to disrespect women or terrorize local shop owners, and he made sure that everyone who worked under him followed the same rules. Break the code, and you were out. Or worse. That's why, when Dutch Schultz insulted him, it wasn't just personal, it was structural. Schultz wasn't just disrespecting Bumpy, he was disrespecting every person in that room, every person in Harlem who looked to Bumpy as the one man who wouldn't let them be humiliated. If Bumpy let it slide, the entire foundation he built would crack. And Schultz knew that, or he should have. But men like Schultz rarely understand power that doesn't come from whiteness or wealth or political connections. They think power is something you inherit, something you take. Bumpy knew better. Power is something you earn, and once you earn it, you protect it, not with speeches, not with threats, with action. The morning after the first body dropped, Bumpy walked through Harlem like nothing had changed. He stopped at a barber shop on 135, got a shave, talked to the owner about business, asked about his family. He went to a diner on 7th Avenue, ordered eggs and coffee, sat by the window where everyone could see him. Calm, unbothered, in control. People noticed. They always noticed Bumpy, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence carried weight. When he walked into a room, conversations paused, not out of fear, out of acknowledgement. This was a man who mattered, and in the days following Schultz's insult, that presence became even more important. Because Harlem was watching, they wanted to see if Bumpy would fold, if he'd let a white mobster walk all over him and do nothing, or if he'd remind the city why his name meant something. Bumpy didn't make announcements. He didn't need to. The streets were already talking. One of Schultz's men was dead. Another had gone missing, and the people who knew, the ones who moved in the shadows, the ones who understood how power actually worked, they knew this was just the beginning. Schultz, meanwhile, was still operating like nothing had changed. He kept his runners working the numbers, kept his enforcers collecting debts, kept acting like Harlem was his playground. He didn't pull back. He didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge that one of his men had been killed. Maybe he thought it was unrelated. Maybe he thought Bumpy didn't have the reach to touch him. Or maybe he just didn't care. But that was his second mistake. The first was the insult. The second was underestimating what Bumpy was willing to do to protect what he built, because by the end of that first week, 2 more bodies had dropped. Not random, not careless, calculated. Each one a man connected to Schultz. Each one a man connected to Schultz. Each one a message. And still, Bumpy never raised his voice. He never made a public threat. He just moved through Harlem like he always did. Visible. Untouchable. In complete control. Because that's what power looks like when it's real. It doesn't need to announce itself. It just is. Bumpy didn't move fast. That's what made it terrifying. Most men, when disrespected, react immediately. They lash out. They make noise. They want everyone to know they're dangerous. Bumpy did the opposite. He waited. Not because he was scared. Not because he was planning some elaborate scheme. He waited because he understood something most criminals don't. Timing is everything. React too fast and you look emotional. You look weak. You look like someone who can be provoked. Wait too long and people think you're soft. They think the insult didn't matter. But wait just long enough for the tension to build, for people to wonder, for your enemy to let his guard down, and then you strike. That's what Bumpy did. 3 days after the insult, the first body dropped. His name was Eddie Marone. Low-level enforcer for Schultz. Collected numbers on Lenox Avenue. Italian. Loud. The kind of guy who thought working for a white mobster made him untouchable in a black neighborhood. He was wrong. Eddie left a bar on 140th Street around midnight. Alone. Drunk enough to be careless. Sober enough to walk straight. He never made it home. 2 days later, a sanitation worker found him in an empty lock near the Harlem River. Single gunshot to the back of the head. No wallet. No witnesses. The police wrote it up as a robbery. They were either stupid or paid to be stupid. because nothing about Eddie's death looked like a robbery. His watch was still on his wrist. His rings were still on his fingers. His shoes, expensive leather, the kind a street thief would grab first, were untouched. This wasn't about money. It was about a message. And the people who mattered got it. Schultz didn't. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't care. Either way, he didn't pull back, didn't slow down, didn't even acknowledge that one of his men had been killed. He kept his operation running like nothing happened. That was his third mistake. Because 5 days after the insult, the second body dropped. His name was Tommy Ruggiero, another one of Schultz's guys. This one higher up the chain. He didn't collect numbers, he supervised the collectors. He reported directly to Schultz's top lieutenant. Tommy was smart. Careful. He didn't drink too much. He didn't walk alone at night. He travelled with a partner. A guy named Sal, who'd been running with Schultz for years. They were driving through Harlem in a black sedan, headed back to the Bronx after making their rounds. They stopped at a red light on 125th Street. A car pulled up beside them. 2 men inside. No words, no warning, just gunfire. Tommy took 3 bullets through the driver's side window, dead before the light turned green. Sal caught one in the shoulder. He survived. Barely. The shooters drove off, disappeared into the Harlem night like ghosts. By the time the police arrived, the only thing left was blood, shattered glass, and 100 witnesses who all claimed they saw nothing. That's how Harlem worked. You don't talk to the cops. Not about Bumpy. Not ever. Because the cops don't protect you. Bumpy does. Sal knew that. So when the detectives asked him who shot them, he looked them in the eye and said he didn't see their faces. He knew what would happen if he talked, and he knew what would happen if he didn't, so he kept his mouth shut. Took the bullet as a lesson, and prayed Schultz wouldn't send him back to Harlem, because by now, even the dumbest guys on Schultz's payroll were starting to understand. This wasn't random. This wasn't a turf war with some nobody crew. This was Bumpy Johnson, and he wasn't finished. The straws started buzzing. Not with panic, with certainty. Everyone knew what was happening. They just didn't know how far it would go. 2 bodies in 5 days, both connected to Schultz, both executed with precision. No collateral damage, no innocent bystanders, no wild shootouts in the middle of the day. Just clean, calculated violence. The kind of violence that doesn't scare people, it earns their respect. Because this wasn't chaos. It was control. And the people of Harlem saw that. They saw Bumpy walking the streets like always, calm, unbothered, untouchable. They saw Schultz's men starting to avoid certain blocks, starting to look over their shoulders. They saw the balance of power shifting, and they knew whose side they were on. But Schultz still didn't pull back. He was too proud, too arrogant, too convinced that his connections would protect him. He sent more men into Harlem, not to apologize, not to negotiate, to intimidate. He wanted to show Bumpy that he couldn't be pushed around, that he wasn't afraid. But fear isn't about what you show, it's about what you feel when the lights go out. And Schultz's men were starting to feel it, because they knew what Bumpy knew. This was just the beginning. Most men, when they realize they're in a war they didn't expect, pull back. They reassess. They negotiate. They find a way out. Dutch Schultz did the opposite. He doubled down, not because he had a strategy, not because he thought he could win, because his ego wouldn't let him walk away. In his mind, backing down from a black man, even one as powerful as Bumpy Johnson, would make him look weak. And in the world Schultz operated in, weakness was death. So he made a choice. He decided to escalate. The morning after Tommy Ruggiero's murder, Schultz held a meeting in the Bronx. His top guys, his enforcers, his most loyal soldiers. He didn't ask for their advice. He didn't strategize. He gave orders. He wanted more men in Harlem, more presence, more pressure. He wanted Bumpy to see that killing 2 of his guys wasn't going to scare him off. He wanted to send a message. I'm not going anywhere. But Schultz made a critical miscalculation. He thought this was about territory, about business, about who controlled the numbers racket. It wasn't. This was about respect, and you can't negotiate respect. You can't intimidate it back into existence. Once it's gone, and Schultz lost Bumpy's respect the moment he said that word. Within 24 hours, Schultz's men were flooding into Harlem, not quietly, not cafely, loud, aggressive, visible. They parked their cars on street corners. stood outside barber shops and diners, made sure everyone saw them. They wanted to look strong. But to the people of Harlem, they looked desperate, because real power doesn't need to perform, it just exists. And Bumpy's power was everywhere, even when he wasn't. One of Schultz's new guys, a kid from the Bronx named Frankie Delano, got sent to collect numbers on 132nd Street. He walked into a barbershop like he owned it, talked loud, made demands, threw his weight around. The barber didn't argue, didn't resist. He just nodded, smiled, handed over the money. And the second Frankie left, he made a phone call. Not to the police, to Bumpy. That's how it worked. Schultz could send 100 men into Harlem. He could flood the streets with enforcers. He could make all the noise he wanted. But the people didn't answer to him. They answered to Bumpy. And every move Schultz made, Bumpy knew about it within the hour. Meanwhile, Schultz was sitting in the Bronx waiting for results. Waiting for Bumpy to flinch. Waiting for some sign that his show of force was working. He got a sign, just not the one he expected. 3 days after Schultz sent his men into Harlem, another body dropped. This time, it wasn't a low-level runner. It was Paulie Torino, one of Schultz's lieutenants. A man who'd been with him for years. A man who handled collections, negotiations, discipline, a man Schultz trusted. Paulie was found in his apartment in the Bronx. Not Harlem. The Bronx. Shot twice in the chest. Front door unlocked. No signs of forced entry. Whoever killed him, he let them in. That's what made it terrifying. Because it meant Bumpy's reach wasn't limited to Harlem. It meant nowhere was safe. The message was clear. You came into my neighborhood. Now I'm coming into yours. Schultz finally started to understand. But instead of pulling back, he got angrier. He called another meeting. This time, the mood was different. His men weren't confident anymore. They were nervous. They were starting to ask questions. Why are we doing this? Why are we going to war over an insult? Why are we losing men over pride? Schultz shut them down. He reminded them who he was, who he was connected to, what he'd built. He told them that backing down now would destroy everything, and he was right. But not in the way he thought. Because the problem wasn't backing down. The problem was that he'd already lost. He just didn't know it yet. By now, word was spreading beyond Harlem, beyond the Bronx. The Italians were hearing about it, the Irish crews, the cops on both sides of the payroll. Everyone was watching, and they were all asking the same question. How is a black man in Harlem going toe-to-toe with Dutch Schultz and winning? Because that's what it looked like. 3 bodies, all connected to Schultz, all executed with precision. And Schultz's response? Sending more men into a neighborhood that didn't want them. That wouldn't protect them. It wasn't strategy. It was suicide. But Schultz couldn't see it. He was too deep, too proud, too convinced that his whiteness, his connections, his reputation would carry him through. He kept pushing, and Bumpy kept waiting, because Bumpy understood something Schultz never would. This wasn't a sprint, it was a siege. You don't win by being the loudest, you win by being the loudest man standing. And Bumpy had time, he had patience, and most importantly, he had Harlem. Every street corner, every barbershop, every numbers runner, every witness, they were all his. Schultz had guns. He had money. He had men. But Bumpy had something more valuable. Loyalty. And in the underworld, loyalty is the only currency that matters. So while Schultz was scrambling, sending more enforcers, making more threats, trying to look strong, Bumpy was doing what he always did, walking the streets, talking to people, staying calm, and planning the next move. Because the war wasn't over. It was just getting started. There's a difference between a massacre and a message. A massacre is loud, chaotic, emotional. A message is quiet, deliberate, unforgettable. What happened over the next 4 days wasn't a bloodbath. It was a countdown. One by one, men connected to Dutch Schultz started disappearing. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic shootout that would make headlines. One by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion. The 4th body was a man named Vincent Costello. He ran a policy bank in East Harlem for Schultz. Skimmed a little off the top, but not enough to get killed over. Or so he thought. Vincent was careful. He didn't go out at night, didn't drink in public, didn't make enemies. But he made one mistake. He kept working for Schultz after the insult. Vincent was found in his car on a quiet street in East Harlem. Engines still running, windows up, single bullet through the temple, no witnesses, no suspects, no noise, just silence. The police didn't even bother investigating. They knew what this was, and they knew better than to get involved. The fifth body was Carlo Messina. He wasn't an enforcer. He wasn't a shooter. He was a bookkeeper. A guy who sat in the back office, counted money, and kept his head down. But he worked for Schultz. And that was enough. Carlo was walking to his apartment in Little Italy, not even in Harlem, when two men stepped out of the shadows. No words. No warning. 3 shots. Sent a mass. He was dead before he hit the ground. The shooters vanished into the night. And the message got louder. It didn't matter if you were a soldier or a bookkeeper. It didn't matter if you were dangerous or harmless. If you worked for Schultz, you were a target. By now, Schultz's organization was starting to fracture. Men were refusing assignments in Harlem. Some were quitting outright. Others were reaching out to rivals, looking for new bosses, new protection, because they understood what Schultz didn't. This wasn't about business anymore. This was personal. And when Bumpy Johnson made something personal, you had 2 choices: get out of the way or get buried. The 6th body was Donnie Sullivan, Irish, tough, former boxer who worked as muscle for Schultz's collection crews. Donnie wasn't afraid of anyone. He'd been in street fights, bar brawls, gang wars. He had a reputation, none of it mattered. He was shot outside a speakeasy on Lenox Avenue, not ambushed, not caught off guard. He saw it coming. Witnesses said he reached for his gun. Never got it out. The shooter walked up to him in broad daylight, put 2 bullets in his chest, and walked away. No one stopped him. No one screamed. No one called the cops. Because this was Harlem, and in Harlem, Bumpy's word was law. Schultz was unraveling. He stopped holding meetings, stopped giving orders, started drinking more. His men could see it. The fear, the realization that he'd bitten off more than he could chew. He tried reaching out to his Italian connections, the Luciano family, the Genoveses. He wanted backup, wanted muscle, wanted someone to step in and fix the problem he'd created. But they didn't. Not because they couldn't. Because they didn't want to. Because getting involved in a war with Bumpy Johnson, over an insult no less, was bad business. Harlem was Bumpy's territory. Everyone knew that, even the Italians, and the smart ones knew better than to go to war over Dutch Schultz's pride. So they told him the same thing, in different words. You made this mess. You clean it up. Schultz was alone, and Bumpy knew it. The 7th body was Anthony Bello, Schultz's driver, a guy who'd been with him for 5 years. Loyal, dependable, harmless. He was shot in his own driveway, in front of his wife. She screamed. She called for help. She begged the neighbors to do something. No one did, because by now, the entire underworld understood. This wasn't random. This wasn't gang violence spiraling out of control. This was surgical. Every man who died had one thing in common. They worked for Schultz. And every death sent the same message. You disrespected me. Now everyone who stands with you will pay. The 8th and final body dropped on the 7th day. His name was Mickey Rourke, not the actor, a low-level runner from Queens who just started working for Schultz 2 weeks earlier. Wrong place. Wrong time. Wrong boss. Mickey didn't even know about the insult. Didn't know who Bumpy Johnson was. Didn't know he was walking into a war. He was sent to collect numbers on 125th Street. Walked into a candy store. Asked the owner for the weekly take. The owner nodded. Went to the back. Made a phone call. 15 minutes later, Mickey walked out of the store. He made it half a block before someone called his name. He turned around. And that was it. 1 shot. Clean. Professional. Mickey collapsed on the sidewalk. Dead before the ambulance arrived. And just like that, it was over. 8 men. 7 days. Not a massacre. A statement. Bumpy never claimed responsibility. Never bragged. Never even mentioned Schultz's name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. And more importantly, everyone understood. You don't disrespect Bumpy Johnson. Not in public. Not in private. Not ever. Because if you do, it's not a matter of if you'll pay. It's a matter of when, and how many people you'll take down with you. On the 8th day, nothing happened. No bodies. No gunshots. No funerals. Just silence. And in the underworld, silence is the loudest sound there is. Dutch Schultz didn't issue a statement. Didn't call a meeting. Didn't send more men into Harlem. He just stopped. His operations in Harlem, the numbers running, the policy banks, the collections, all of it pulled back. Quietly, quickly, no announcements, no explanations. One day his men were on every corner. The next, they were gone. It wasn't a retreat, it was a disappearance. Because retreating would mean admitting defeat, and men like Schultz don't admit anything. They just vanish and pretend it never happened. But everyone knew. The streets knew. The cops knew. The other crime families knew. Dutch Schultz walked into Harlem, disrespected Bumpy Johnson in front of witnesses, and paid for it with 8 bodies in 7 days. And the only reason it stopped at 8 was because Bumpy decided it was enough. Not because he had to stop. Because he chose to. That's power. Real power isn't about how much damage you can do. It's about knowing when to stop. Bumpy could have kept going. He could have hunted down every man who ever worked for Schultz. Could have turned it into a full-scale war. But he didn't. Because this was never about revenge. It was about respect. And once the lesson was taught, there was no need to keep teaching it. The point was made. Schultz knew it. His men knew it. Every mobster, hustler, and street operator in New York knew it. You don't say that word to Bumpy Johnson. You don't disrespect him in public. You don't test him. Because he won't argue. He won't threaten. He won't give you a warning. He'll just act. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late. In the weeks that followed, life in Harlem went back to normal. Bumpy walked the streets like he always did. Stopped at the same barbershops. Ate at the same diners. Talked to the same people. Calm. Unbothered. In control. No one asked him about Schultz. No one mentioned the bodies. They didn't need to. The respect was already there, louder than before. Because now, it wasn't just respect born from reputation, it was respect born from proof. Schultz, meanwhile, never recovered. Not from the deaths. From the humiliation. He'd been challenged by a black man in Harlem and forced to back down. In front of the entire underworld, his reputation took a hit he couldn't repair. His organization started losing ground. Men who once feared him started questioning him, and within a few months, Schultz had bigger problems than Bumpy Johnson. The law was closing in, the mob was turning on him. His enemies were circling. By October of 1935, just months after the insult, Dutch Schultz was dead, shot in a bathroom in New Jersey by rival mobsters. Some say it was the Italians. Some say it was the feds closing in and his own people cutting him loose. But in Harlem, they told a different story. They said Schultz died the moment he disrespected Bumpy. Everything after that was just his body catching up. And maybe that's not literally true. But in the world Bumpy operated in, perception is reality. And the perception was clear. You come for Bumpy, you don't walk away clean. The story of those 7 days became legend. It got told in barbershops and pool halls, passed down from OGs to young hustlers trying to learn the game. It became a lesson, not about violence, about respect, about how power isn't loud. It's quiet, it's patient, it's precise, and about how the most dangerous men are the ones who shoot first. They're the ones who wait, who watch, who move only when the moment is right. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. He didn't need to be the toughest guy in the room. He just needed to be the smartest. And in 1935, when a white mobster made the mistake of thinking his skin color made him untouchable, Bumpy reminded the world that in Harlem, the only thing that mattered was respect. And respect, once lost, can't be bought back. It can only be earned. Or taken. Bumpy took his, and he held on to it for the rest of his life. Not through fear, not through violence, through discipline, through loyalty. Through understanding that real power doesn't need to announce itself, it just is. Years later, people would ask Bumpy about that week, about the 8 bodies, about Schultz, about what really happened. And Bumpy would smile. That calm, quiet smile he was known for, and he'd say the same thing every time. I don't know what you're talking about. But everyone knew, and that was enough. Because the story wasn't about the bodies, it was about the message, and the message was simple: respect is everything. Without it, you're nothing, and if you're foolish enough to disrespect a man who built his empire on it, you won't get a second chance. Dutch Schultz learned that the hard way. And the streets never forgot.